This presentation is about the doctrine of double effect. This idea is introduced in the study guide as an action which would be wrong if it were done intentionally may be permissible if we bring it about merely as a foreseen consequence of doing something else which is good. Now, that's as good as far as it goes, but I think we can complain that it's a little bit frustratingly vague because it simply says an action may be permissible if we bring it about in such and such a way. One thing that's quite useful when we're doing philosophy and we have an idea like this that we really want to test is to work out what it says about the necessary or sufficient conditions for harm or some sort of relevant type of action to be permitted. Right? Now, that's an important bit of terminology, and you may not all be comfortable with what I'm getting at when I say the phrase necessary and sufficient conditions. The idea is fairly intuitive, but it's important you keep the two separate in your head. If you want a bit of a refresher on what I mean by that, I recommend the video, which you can link to here. Okay, it's a nice little tutorial on what I mean by that. Okay, but I will briefly be explaining the idea of what a necessary and sufficient condition is as we go forward. Okay, so here we've got this vague idea that an action which would be wrong if done intentionally might turn out to be okay, might be morally justified if we bring it about in this certain way with a certain sort of different intention. Right? Well, let's see if we can get that idea sharpened up by putting it in terms of a necessary or sufficient condition. I think the idea occurs in a lot of places, but I think that probably the standard presentation is to put it as actually a sufficient condition for harm to be wrong. Okay, so here's an example of the sort of formulation I mean. If, in intending to do X, we intend to commit an evil, either as an end or as a means to a greater good, then it's not permitted for us to do X. Now, all that means is, by being a sufficient condition, what we're saying there is, if you satisfy this certain sort of psychological condition about how you intend to do this action X, then that's enough on its own for us to conclude that the action is not permitted. It's sufficient. Now, there's a nifty trick though with necessary and sufficient conditions. If you can say some condition X is sufficient for Y, well then it just follows that not X is necessary for not Y. Okay. Let me just give you a rather silly little example. I take it that boiling potatoes is a sufficient condition for cooking them. Right? It's not the only way to cook them, but if you do boil them, that'll be enough. They will be cooked. You can apply that reversal trick though and say, then a necessary condition for not cooking your potatoes is that you don't boil them. Right? And that seems pretty intuitive. What do we mean here by necessary condition? Well, it's something that has to be true for the first thing to be true, right? For it to be true that we've not cooked our potatoes, it has to be true that you haven't boiled your potatoes. It's a necessary condition. Now, remember what we were doing with the doctrine of double effect. We were just trying to work out when it tells us that harm is permitted. But what I said the orthodox formulation was to give you a sufficient condition for harm to not be permitted. Right? But you can just apply this trick and flip it around and say, well, what's the opposite of being not permitted? That is being permitted. Right? And therefore, what's a necessary condition of it being permitted? It's that you not intend the harm, either as a means or as an end in itself. Okay? Just making this absolutely explicit. Here's the way it was: is if, in intending to do X, we intend to commit an evil, either as an end or as a means for greater good, then not permitted. Well, flip it around. If it's permitted, then it must not be the case that we intend to commit an evil, either as an end or as a means to a greater good. Right? Just to sketch this idea out for you, suppose that, so roughly the idea is, here you are, and you're wondering, should I do X? Okay, and we want to know, is it going to be permissible or not permissible for you to do X? Well, the Doctrine of Double Effect says we have to check out, is X something that you're aiming at because you're using it as a means to a greater good? Or is X the end you're aiming at in itself? You actually just want to do the harmful thing, X. If either of those conditions is the case, well then that's sufficient for it to be not permissible. Okay? And that just means the flip side of that is, if it is permissible for you to do X, it must be the case that you are not intending it as a greater good, X as a means to a greater good, nor are you intending X as an end in itself. Rather, the X, this is the harmful aspect of what you're planning to do, it must merely be a foreseen outcome, but not intended, right? You would happily dispense with it if you could get away, if you could drop that from your plan. Okay. So, resuming. How could you mount some sort of philosophical argument or objection to the doctrine of double effect? The best strategy, the most sort of powerful strategy, I think, that would be quite direct, is if you could find a case where somebody meets the condition, that is, the condition where we intend the harm as an end or as a means, but the action actually is permissible. Okay? And Judith Thomson gives this example of Alfred and giving his wife something to drink that fits exactly that mold. Okay, so coming back to here, Alfred is wondering, can I give my wife this drink? Now, Alfred thinks that giving her the drink is poisoning her. He wants to poison her. Okay. The Doctrine of Double Effect says, well, if you intend a harmful thing as your end, then your action is not permissible. But Thomson points out, in this case, Alfred's mistaken, and X is the only substance that will save her from some illness she's suffering. Right? In that case, she says, it really is permissible to give her X, even though he has this terrible intention. Okay. What about the loop case? Right? In the loop case, what is your intention? I'm not going to resolve that for you, but think about it in these terms. Right? You're supposed to know that the left-hand track goes like this, the right-hand track goes like this, and loops around. Here are our 5 people on the left-hand track. Here's our 1 person on the right-hand track. Right? Now, if you know the setup, when you divert the trolley to the right, killing the 1, do you, 1, intend to harm the 1 as a means to a greater good, or as an end in itself? Okay, is that your aim, just to get rid of the 1, right? Well, I hope it's not that one, right? But the hard question is it necessary for you to intend it as a means to a greater good? And if that's the case, what does the Doctrine of Double Effect say? I think you should be able to draw your conclusion for yourself from this one. And since that's the topic of one of your assignment questions, I think I won't say any more.